You skipped the best line. But there are values that can be served only with my sauce.
With my sauce, yeah.
You made it sound so much worse when you said it like that.
That's how I read it.
No, I was flowing when I was reading this.
Sorry.
When you said it, you were like, "Yeah, served with my sauce."
Served with my sauce.
Oh, yeah, try my sauce on that. Okay, well, took the wind out of my sails there.
Oh, sorry. Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
My name is Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right, we're just two guys embracing the whole of mankind.
That's right. There it is.
When your edit came in, I was guffawing. It was so funny.
I was listening to that while I was editing, and I was like, I can't believe we just let that go right by us.
So intently reading the quote that we just glazed right over it.
Yeah, so anyway, this go around, we read
Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. Born in Martinique in 1925, Frantz Fanon was uniquely positioned to write about the colonial experience. Having grown up under the French colonial empire, Fanon witnessed firsthand the mask-off racism of the French under the Nazi collaborationist regime of World War II. Working as a physician, he traveled to Algeria and later was exiled to Tunis, where Fanon compiled groundbreaking works on the colonial project and its effect on the psychology of man. Not simply an intellectual, he was also an active member of the Algerian independence movement, the FLN, and an inspiration for resistance movements across the crumbling colonial world. Fanon worked tirelessly until his death from leukemia at an early age of 36, notably under the gaze of the CIA.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm not acting conspiratorially here, but he was diagnosed with leukemia. He was treated in the Soviet Union. They had not progressed as far on the disease at that point, and so he was actually recommended by his Soviet doctors to seek medical asylum, I guess, in the U.S. He was secreted into the U.S. by the CIA, where they reportedly, left him in a hotel room for a couple of days until he developed pneumonia. He was then treated for leukemia and died of double pneumonia, which I don't know what makes it double, but...
yeah, nor do I.
And I'm not saying the CIA killed him. He had leukemia, okay, but... Just interesting that a world-renowned intellectual, revolutionary, anti-colonialist figure would be accepted into the United States by the CIA to be treated for a disease. I don't know, just a little curious.
Seems a little suspect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, it hadn't occurred to me until this very moment, but being such a Camus stan, I wonder what Fanon's relationship was with Camus, given Camus' unique positioning with the Algerian liberation.
Yes, we spoke very briefly about how Camus was not particularly fond of Algerians.
Yeah.
So that is a curious question. Question.
I wonder.
Yeah.
I'm sure their paths crossed, being two well-known intellectuals.
Yeah. I've read a little bit of Wretched of the Earth, as you know, and Sartre does the intro for that one. Mm-hmm. And on the Wikipedia page, at least, that was actually the culmination of a meeting that they had before Fanon's death. They spent like 3 days talking, and he agreed to write the preface for Wretched of the Earth, mm-hmm. which I've also seen clowned on quite a bit online. I'll have to go back and do some analysis myself. But I'm really glad that we read this book. It is an odd one. Odd is probably not the right way to talk about it.
It's an outlier in the context of the project that we're doing with this show, for sure. But it was definitely, it's beautifully written.
Certainly.
And it gave me some interesting ideas, some things to ponder that, much like our last reading with Mutual Aid with Kropotkin, it made me zoom out a little bit and think a lot more abstractly about the revolution, revolutionaries, and our relationship with one another. Mm-hmm. How that every topic that I wrote down to talk about is really just examining like the interior politics of revolutionary groups, as opposed to like what the revolution would actually look like or be like. You know what I mean?
I guess we'll have to see. Yeah. I'm not sure I quite follow. Because, when we started this book, I was a little worried. I was like, I don't think that this is going to be relevant to our conversation. Not that it's not relevant. I think that it's obviously relevant. Right? The revolutionary project is shrouded in race all over, especially in the United States. Shrouded, not the right verb there, but it's encased.
Ensconced.
Yeah, they're hand in hand. It's, the U.S. has a class problem that is reinforced as a race problem. It's a real fucking, it's not resolved, okay? Yeah. That much is clear. So both as an introduction into Fanon's work and also as just a bit of, like you said, a zooming out of this picture, I think is worthwhile. And I'm glad to say that I think that remained true throughout the read.
Yeah. I think what was most intriguing to me about it is that kind of troubled, wrought relationship that race and class have in the United States.
Yeah.
I assume it's similar everywhere in the West, at least. But
just to touch on that for a second, because that was something that I was thinking about early on, is that the French experience, I should say, is different than the American experience in a way that I think is really interesting. Reading Fanon, he's clearly talking about the lens that he has experienced the world through, which is, growing up in the Antilles, in North Africa and West Africa. France's colonial empire is certainly different. I mean, like, we're talking about the transplant of white people onto somebody's native land as opposed to the stealing of black people and taking them to America. I just think that it's interesting to kind of juxtapose the two situations. I don't know how much it really matters, the difference, but you can see Fanon even talks about it when he's talking about race relations in France versus race relations in America in this.
Yeah, I was going to say that as I was getting through the book, I was thinking a lot about Baldwin, and Baldwin moving to France in the mid-20th century, spending a good chunk of his adult life in France to escape the preponderance of white supremacy in the United States, and talked so favorably about the difference living as a black man in Paris as opposed to living as a black man in Harlem. And I don't know, Fanon is certainly not as forgiving.
Yes.
And speaks of it much more like Paris isn't the racial utopia that everyone makes it out to be, or France is.
Yeah. Not to get ahead of myself, but I love when he says, if you say that France is the least racist country, then, like, what can I say? Like, racism is racism, really. It's absurd to put it in that framework, but there really is a difference between the two in that sense. It's interesting to hear about Baldwin.
I really wanted to start with this quote from the introduction, if we could, because it was the first thing that really spoke to me. It's on page 16 of the introduction. It's near the bottom. My true wish is to get my brother, black or white, to shake off the dust from that lamentable livery built upon over centuries of incomprehension.
I did highlight that also. The one I thought you were going to pick up on is right above. Not right above, but about a paragraph above, when he says, many blacks will not recognize themselves in the following pages, likewise many whites. But the fact that I feel alien to the world of the schizophrenic or of the sexually impotent in no way diminishes the reality.
Yeah.
And it just really made me think of every time that you're like, I don't have to be gay to defend gay people. I don't have to be trans to defend trans people. It's like that built-in ethics. It just really spoke to me about that.
Yeah, for sure. And I just thought that the quote that I selected there, I thought did a really good job of contextualizing the intention of what he was writing here, to get us to recognize the way that our racialized perceptions impact our interactions with one another. And he spends a good chunk of the book talking about how we internalize those things and how we allow them to dictate parts of our identity that therefore play into this narrative that continues to perpetuate that cycle.
Yeah.
I appreciated in the introduction getting that right at the front to kind of set, like, okay, I understand what the intention of the book is. Now I can contextualize everything through that lens.
I agree. There's something that he says, what's the point of this analysis, right? The parts that I felt the most frustrated with this book are the most psychoanalytical parts.
100%.
I think that's clear. Anybody reading this today that's not a devout scholar of Freud, I think, will run into the same struggles. The first part of this book, I think, is very straightforward in a way, and he's often doing this. My mind jumped to the quote on page 59 where he says, right, what's the objective of such an analysis? He's talking about Jean Venus here, right, the intellectual black man in France. He's quoting Sartre when he says, make them aware of the possibilities they have denied themselves or the passiveness they have displayed in situations where it was really necessary to cling to the heart of the world, to force, if needed, the rhythm of the world's heart. It's saying this analysis is meant to show you, but it's really meant to get you to act. Yeah. Right. He is against this passiveness, against this almost like this spectatorism. And he's really saying, like, we have to act in order to change this. It will not just dissolve itself. It has to be done.
Yeah. Along those same lines, a few years ago, I wrote a song called Kindness is No Cure, because I was getting really annoyed and frustrated with the kind of tendency to talk about things like racism and homophobia and stuff dying across generations.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if I just raise my children to see everyone as equal, then these things will just go away. And that's obviously a broken, silly attitude because these systems perpetuate themselves. And what's funny, around this time, one of my close friends' kids said something that was like very alarming to Kristen and I, because she was playing with her like Barbie dolls or whatever, and was talking about them in the context of one being evil and one being good. And the black Barbie was the evil one. The good one was the white Barbie. She's a white child.
Sure.
And it was like, we were asking, like, why is that? You know, where does that come from?
Yeah.
Why is this one evil? Why is this one good? And she just like straight up said, like, because this one's black.
Right.
And it's like, I know that this child's parents aren't outwardly racist and certainly do a lot to like espouse an egalitarian worldview and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it's just like, this is the way the insidious nature of things like racism seep in from the root. And yeah, so this idea that it's something that will just go away is silly, and we need to examine and attack those things. It's not something that will just happen passively.
Right.
It requires an active intention.
I think it's so interesting because like that's like the classical, like during the civil rights movement, that was a psychological study, right? The black baby doll.
Yep.
You know, I remember learning about that in school.
Yeah.
And it's crazy to think that that kind of system perpetuates itself up through today. Throughout all of the struggle, throughout all of the advancement that we've made societally, it's like those things are still there. Those things are still evident. And the thing that Fanon says that I really appreciate is that it will require mutual recognition. Just to ignore the idea of black and white and the reciprocity or the juxtaposition between the two is not going to change the facts, right? It's not going to change the system underlying. It has to be like a mutual understanding. And at the base level, right, I think that the challenge is that the difference is in appearance, you know, like I love when we're getting all over the place. I've already completely shattered the idea of chapters here. But when he's talking about the anti-Semite, right?
Yeah. He pulls so much from Sartre's writing on anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting because I think that he's talking about the kernel of truth in Sartre's writing. And then I love that he goes around and says, like, here's where he fucking missed it all, dude.
Yeah.
The like 1 or 2 pages that are takedowns of Sartre were riveting to me. I was like, whoa.
Same.
Whoa. Yes. He says that, you know, we're not discriminated on based on an idea. The Jew can hide its Jewishness.
Yeah.
Right? I am slave to my appearance. You know, so to ignore that, to be colorblind or whatever, is to miss the point. Like, we have to recognize that this dynamic has built up around us. That dust of dreaded livery or whatever he says, like, that needs to be actively disturbed.
Yeah. And the other thing that was kind of rolling through my mind while reading this over the course of the last few weeks, we took longer to read this than we typically would. And so, like, I've been it's been germinating.
Churning. Yeah, I know.
I don't know if that's the right word, but the thing that I've really been thinking about with it is very few things about our attitudes and our worldview can be changed from without. It requires a change from within. I think anyone that has had a conversation with the racist uncle about race recognizes that their defense of anti-racism in response to their racist uncle is not changing the attitude of their racist uncle.
Yeah.
It's probably mostly just like a
self-soothing.
thing, something that we do to convince ourselves that we've done something of value. But it's not doing much, if anything, to change that racist attitude. Same thing with homophobia, transphobia, stuff like that. That, I feel like, almost always has to come from within. That change has to come from a change of heart and attitude that one finds oneself. That's part of why, even though I didn't really like the psychoanalysis bits here, I do appreciate where Fanon is coming from with that, because I think it does have to come from an acknowledgement within.
Well, you know, the thing is, I absolutely agree. I mean, right at the beginning of that chapter, which is chapter 8, The Black Man in Psychopathology, he says it. He gives a great definition, right? He says that psychoanalysis, and this can never be stressed enough, sets out to understand a given behavior within a specific group represented by the family. And in the case of an adult's neurosis, the analyst's job is to find an analogy in the new psychic structure with a certain infantile element, a repetition or a copy of conflicts born within the family constellation. And I just think that's a great definition, right? It's saying there is an element of the structure that you are currently operating within that is born from an experience in the past. Even later on, he says, it cannot be said more positively. There is a determined Erlebnis, which is just experience, right? Lived experience at the origin of every neurosis, right? I mean, I know we're materialists, but like that's just really the case,
Yeah.
you know? It's no wonder that even with all of this pre-Oedipal, post-Oedipal, you know, post-clitoral, vaginal, what, like all of that crazy shit that I was rolling my eyes at, there's still a kernel of truth there at the very least. You know, it's no wonder that psychoanalysis was so lauded, because it does get at, I think, something that people are very willing to understand, you know, that your experiences inform your life.
Yeah.
But it is you know, it is a little kooky when he starts talking about the phallic stage.
Yeah, he gets into some stuff, especially with kind of sexual feelings and sexual manifestations that are definitely very Freudian and certainly very strange.
Yeah.
And has quite a lot to say about sexual assault in a very odd way that I didn't quite know how to contextualize. In the context of that chapter, I was like, is he saying that this is true, or is he saying that this experience is what we need to push back against?
Yeah.
Of this, like, psychoanalysis of this experience is what needs to be changed.
That's the thing. There's a way that the flow of what he's writing, it feels like it really has to be read all the way through. Because
Yeah.
if I were to try to take this out of context, I feel like I would pick a quote that he's actually quoting himself to then say, like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It really makes the most sense if you're reading it front to back, not necessarily the whole book, but just like these ideas are all encapsulated within this framework. It's almost like oration is what it feels like. It feels like I'm at a lecture, you know, like he's building on these ideas in a way, but he's also saying these things as a third party.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
It can be a little confusing sometimes.
It's kind of a narrative device where he'll say something and then later he'll come back to it and say, like, and that's where this came from.
Right.
In a way that, like, if, like you said, if you didn't read through the whole chunk of that section or whatever, you would be kind of lost.
You have to catch his wink. That's the thing. There's a lot of
that's a good way to
times
put it.
where he's saying something ironically, you know, and I think if you were just like to open the page and read the quote and be like, ah, yes, you know, but like in the chapter where he's talking about Monsieur Manoni, where he is relentlessly mocking Manoni, you know, he's like, this is intellectually valid, but there's some real fucking ridiculous shit in here. He'll say, like, isn't that right, Monsieur? You know, it's in his writing style. You know, what's interesting is that, speaking of oration, is that the Wretched of the Earth was actually transcribed. It was spoken on his deathbed.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I read a really interesting, I don't think it's the same translator as this book, but I read a really interesting, I think it's at the afterword, it's a translator's note of Wretched of the Earth, where he's talking about the difficulty in translating Fanon because his voice is so present, and it's also, you know, loaded with these literary ideas. And I just thought that was really interesting, but you can definitely see it in this book as well.
Yeah, that's what I thought was one of the most noteworthy things about his style, is how free-flowing it is with references and allusion, and how he's coming in and out of voice or character almost sometimes.
You know what? Like, there's almost like a motif. He's just dropping it back in there. You know what it was? Ia bon banania. Anytime he would bring up that slogan, you know, I don't know if you looked up Ia bon banania it's a fucking banana advertisement, but it features a Senegalese man, just a big grinning man with a big red fez. Every time he would drop that back in there, it was like just right into my fucking face, dude.
Are you a Vonnegut fan?
I am.
That's like So It Goes, you know? It
Yeah,
goes up
exactly.
157 times or something.
Man. Okay, sorry, I threw us way off the path there.
No, that's okay. Let's jump back into the chapter there.
There's a lot about language, right? I think that the chapter on language was really a great way to start.
Yeah, I will say that on page 4, even in the very start of the first chapter, he says, after giving this Creolism quote or whatever he's talking about, he says, "Yes, I must watch my diction because that's how they'll judge me. He can't even speak French properly," they'll say, with the utmost contempt. And it got me thinking a lot about the colonization of language. And as an English teacher, or former English teacher, I guess, my own kind of wrought experience with that. Because it's so hard to find a meaningful balance between, I mean, as an English teacher it was, I guess, hard to find a meaningful balance between allowing oneself to speak in true voice, you know, colloquialisms and different slang and different things that one might use. Growing up the way I grew up, there's quite a lot of Appalachian stuff in the way that I speak when I'm not trying to sound formal or whatever. And the allowances that we make for things like that versus the things that we police and say that are no longer allowed. And how language itself is a tool of colonization in our I don't know, it's just like it's so difficult to find a way to have something that is universal, like language, that allows people to communicate freely while also allowing people to be free in the way that they communicate.
You can drive yourself fucking crazy thinking about language. I love when he quotes the guy saying, "Language is God, astray in the flesh."
Yeah.
That was fantastic. But it's a discussion we've had a lot. You know what it really made me think of is when we talked about having to know the rules to break them.
Yeah.
Right? You know, when we talked about that originally, I think that the conclusion was affirmative, right? You do need to know the rules to break them, especially in the scope of a school, you know, of education, right? But the thing that I'm thinking of upon reading this book is like, whose rules are we teaching? The rules are ultimately set to reinforce the system.
It's that paternal militarization again that he talks about later. It's the same sort of thing.
Yeah, the duplication of the family structure in the state or whatnot.
Yep.
You're right. It is such a fine line that has to be walked because I don't know. Actually, it's tough. I'm struggling with it because there's so many different layers of it. Just now, what flashed into my mind was the whole fucking when we talked about capitalist realism, the idea of the alternative being absorbed anyway. It's like even if I am to rage against these rules, that too will be encapsulated. How can you really come to the truth of the truth? What the fuck am I talking about? This is what makes it so complicated. The problem is that I'm looking for universality, I think, and I don't know if that's proper.
I mean, certainly with something like language, that's non-existent.
Yeah.
The idea is that it's, quote, the truth or the correct language is the one that's just lauded by the most powerful group, you know? That's what's interesting about having been an English teacher, right?
Yeah.
Is that there are rules to the way English works. English as a language is terrible, but like there are rules to the way that it works. And in the context that we taught in, which was an urban population, overwhelmingly black, AAVE has the same set of rules. They're different rules, but they have rules nonetheless.
Yeah.
The rules are just as concrete, but we are conditioned to look down on those rules and prioritize the rules of the white supremacist English language that we're force-fed.
This is out of my area of expertise, clearly. I'm just thinking about what he's saying. I guess it might be a difference in, again, the French thing and the American thing, right? Because I'm just thinking about when he's talking about pigeon, right? When he's talking about code switching, basically. He says, you know, to speak gobbledygook to a black man is to make a black man the right? Which, I'm so sorry. Fantastic quote, though. Even on the next page, on 17, he says, to speak pigeon is to say, stay where you are.
Yeah.
How much is that, I almost said allowance. Like, how much is that acceptance of that language an allowance of stay where you are? You know what I mean? Like, I'm thinking about AAVE, right? Clearly, it is linguistically appropriate, whatever, culturally appropriate. I'm trying not to back myself into a corner here, obviously. But at what point are we saying...
Well, there's an inherent alterity to that, right? Like the idea that there is a, quote, allowance for other forms of language, other forms of communication, is inherently othering something. And so, like, there isn't a quote, like, stay where you are kind of aspect to the, again, quote, allowance of other forms of communication, other forms of language, right? But with that allowance comes otherness. Because, like you said, it's linguistically, other forms of language like AAVE, they're linguistically appropriate, they're culturally appropriate, whatever. They have just as much merit as every other form of language.
They exist.
Exactly. But like under what power structure, right? Because inherently the allowance, quote unquote, allowance under the current power structure will other the use of AAVE. And so the supposed empowerment that comes along with acknowledging and instead of code switching, code meshing and all this sort of thing where we like bring it into a part of our identity and like celebrate it. We're celebrating othering others, you know, othering folks. We're celebrating that distance, not a coming together.
The flip side of that, however, I think is something that Fanon touches on in this book as well. I'm just thinking about in the end when he's talking about the white man just accedes, right? They just said, you're free now. The black man didn't have to fight for it, which... historically rot, whatever.
Again, I think he's talking about that from a very French perspective too. I'm thinking of it through the American.
Well, he does say that the Americans fight.
Yeah.
He does say that the Americans fight. So that is a big difference there. But I'm just thinking about like if say like I'm not entirely familiar with code meshing like you're saying, but I'm just thinking about if we're looking at that as the problem, the separation of those languages as an othering thing, then your first response might be, well, just put them together, But the imbalance in the structure of power and the racial dynamic of fucking all history essentially prevents that conjoining from being equitable. What is the equitable solution here?
Yeah.
Because to just say like, okay, I wash my hands of it, we'll just use AAVE as well as my regular white English or whatever. Wave, dude. I saw wave on
White American.
Yeah, white American vernacular English. Same soup, just reheated. That kind of shit. But like, what's the equitable solution? At the basic level, I'm certain it is mutual recognition like Fanon is talking about, but I'm curious as to what that looks like, especially in a scenario such as we are in America today, where, many of the most racist people have they're past racism, they're post racism, like racism is a thing of history, quote unquote, in their minds, right? How do you change that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer to your question.
Yeah.
The only thing that I keep thinking about is that anytime there is a state apparatus, there's going to be a monopolization of power, a monopolization of violence, whatever, but that's not really relevant to this context. There's going to be a monopolization of power. And so, like, the answer is whatever the state wants it to be, The irony in the United States, of course, is that a lot of the folks that decry AAVE don't even speak WAVE, WAVE correctly. It's wild that we went so deep on language there.
Well, language is powerful. Like earlier when we were talking about universality, language is maybe the most individual thing because your individual interpretation is always going to be different to some degree. So we're talking about creating a collective structure over something that is deeply personal, deeply individual to an extent. And I think that there's just a conflict there that is liable to get in the way of a lot of fucking things. Even on the purely philosophical level, right? When I say laptop, your picture of a laptop is different than mine.
Sure.
There is no universal picture of a laptop.
No platonic ideal.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, that sounded condescending, but thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, fucking philosopher over here. But that's the thing. So to an extent, it is individual. I'm just making the same point again.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Fanon brings up Hegel quite a bit as he gets through the book, talking a lot about dialectics. And there is something inherently immaterial to language, even though it is necessary to describe our material conditions. Our interpretation of that description will vary wildly because there's no material basis. There's no absolute. There's no North Star that we can all pin to exactly the same.
Yeah.
And so, there's always going to be some level around language of individuality, of interpretation, of abstraction.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about we're more than willing to flatten ideas for the purpose of exploration. At what point do they need to be expanded back upon, right? I'm thinking about when Fanon says, towards the end, he's like, there is not one Negro. There are many black men. It's the idea, like more recently you'll hear of it as, it's not a monolith.
Not a monolith, yeah.
Exactly. And it's like, for the purposes of this discussion, he is flattening the idea to one understandable ideal, basically.
Yeah,
but at the end of the day, the reality of it is that there are many scenarios, many situations, We're putting a lot out there, and then it's like really tough to finish the idea.
Yeah, well, I mean...
Welcome to philosophy.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Trying to bring it back to the text a little bit. I'm looking on page 18, one of the quotes that stood out to me. This is right around where he's talking about speaking pidgin.
Mm-hmm.
He says, but outside of university circles, there is an army of fools. It is a question not of educating them, but of teaching the black man not to be a slave of their archetypes. So, I don't know, I'm thinking of that in the context of this conversation around language, where this feels like a gross oversimplification, but it's not about getting everyone to accept other forms of language as legitimate. It's about getting us to acknowledge that their acceptance is meaningless to us.
Yeah. The ultimate goal maybe is colorblindness. It's just that to get there, we have to recognize color,
Race will always be a consideration until it no longer needs to be.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right. But the thing is like, who's doing the considering initially? It's the white man.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I love the way that Fanon talks about the way the white gaze comes into play. It's like we have found the occasion to confront the white gaze. It's like, oh, the white gaze appeared over the horizon and suddenly we were black. I really love when he talks about those things.
My God!
Kind of going back to that action over the intellect. I love this quote on page 12 near the top. It is important, however, to tell the black man that an attitude of open rupture has never saved anybody. Although it is true that I must free myself from my strangler because I cannot breathe, nevertheless it is unhealthy to graft a psychological element, the impossibility of expanding, onto a physiological base, the physical difficulty of breathing. To continue, what does this mean? Quite simply this: when an Antillian with a degree in philosophy says he's not sitting for aggregation because of his color, my response is that philosophy never saved anybody.
Yeah.
When another desperately tries to prove to me that the black man is as intelligent as any white man, my response is that neither did intelligence save anybody. For if equality among men is proclaimed in the name of intelligence and philosophy, it is also true that these concepts have been used to justify the extermination of man.
Yeah, that hit me so fucking hard.
Yeah.
And I've got a wow quote as he continued on there at the top of the next page. He gets to talking about Sartre there.
Yeah.
And then he says, whites are only accidentally interested. Our history takes place in obscurity, and the sun I carry with me must lighten every corner. What a fucking banger line. It's just so beautiful and so profound.
Yeah.
The sun I carry with me must lighten every corner. God damn, the sense of purpose, the feeling of the responsibility, and how fucking easy it is to just be a white man.
I was going to say, I really appreciate the way that he brings in a lot of poetry, a lot of art, I would say. I'm trying not to downplay it or anything. So much of the truth that he is trying to communicate to us comes from an emotion. It comes from something that's not empirical. It's not scientific. There's so much Aimé Césaire in this book, right? And it's because, partially at least, it's because Aimé Césaire is Frantz Fanon's mentor.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
No, I think that kind of poetic language calls back to the point that you made earlier about how important language really is. Like, I think the profundity of his phrasing, the profundity of his prose, if I can say it like that, is part of what makes it so powerful, part of what makes the reaction to it so palpable. I'm really stuck on the plosive words here.
What's kind of fucking me up, though, is he talks about that thing where he's saying that, like, emotion is ascribed to the black man, you know? I'm not going to be able to get all my pieces together for this point. But, you know, when he's talking about how the black man uses the French language so explosively, so incredibly, it's like it'll make a woman faint, you know?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Like, I'm not saying we're falling into that same trap here. It's just a little odd. I don't think it really is that important.
Yeah, I think I would push back on that to the point that, like, I think we're responding to the writer of this book, you know?
Yeah.
I think, like...
We're not saying, like, oh, the black prose is so incredible.
Yeah, exactly. I think, obviously, that's unconsciously always going to be a part of, like, our interactions with his writing. But I think what I found so profound about the book was the beauty of his prose. I don't think it has to get much more raw
Fair
than
enough.
that.
Fair enough. Totally. That's why I was like, this is not an important point. There's so much in this book that was really good, but I don't think we're going to have the chance to talk about it. Like, I'm just thinking, like, I love the bit at the beginning of the lived experience chapter. The nothing doing at the end is so good. So good. So good. So good. So good. I don't have much to say other than it's fucking great.
Yeah, I just wrote, wow. I mean, there are quite a lot of those quotes where I just was just awestruck with the profound nature of what he was saying. He says, I came into this world anxious to uncover the meaning of things, my soul desirous to be at the origin of the world, and here I am, an object among other objects. Locked in this suffocating reification, I appealed to the other so that his liberating gaze, gliding over my body suddenly smoothed of rough edges, would give me back the lightness of being I thought I had lost, and taking me out of the world, put me back in the world. But just as I get to that other slope, I stumble, and the other fixes me with his gaze, his gestures and attitudes, the same way you fix a preparation with a die. I lose my temper, demand an explanation. Nothing doing. I explode. Here are the fragments put together by another me.
Yeah, man.
That's just so fucking... Back to that thing about language and the immaterial kind of nature of it. I can't even articulate, certainly I can't articulate it eloquently, what that makes me feel, the response that I have to reading that.
It's just that it's so... It is eloquent. I don't want to keep harping on the language there, but that's literally the thing. He's talking about all of this beautifully, and then when he's talking to the other, he's like, why? Why are you doing this? You know, he's demanding this. And what's the response? Nothing doing.
Yeah.
You know, nothing doing. That's fucking amazing.
It's a pretty good encapsulation of the post-colonial term ambivalence, which he does use quite a bit through here, but I can't help but have been an English teacher for a good deal of my life, and having taught literature through a post-colonial lens, the idea of ambivalence is an important one, and I think that that's a pretty good representation of what is meant by ambivalence. This emphatic, driven anger, this purposeful anger, this response, like, why? And the response is nothing doing. Like,
it's just the fact that the response is pigeon. I mean, that's what's so... I know that this is literally the point. Like, that's the device he's using here. But it's so fucking good, you know? Just to go back to the language chapter, right below the gobbledygook quote, he says, you know, we'll be told there's no intention to willfully give offense. Okay. But it is precisely this absence of will, this offhand manner, this casualness, and the ease at which they classify him, imprison him at an uncivilized and primitive level that is insulting. You know, that's it. It's like, why are you objectifying me? Why are you othering me? And the guy just says, nothing doing.
Yeah.
You know?
The absence of will, exactly.
You know, fuck.
Which is why it exactly why it is a call to action. It's the suggestion that this ambivalent attitude will do nothing but perpetuate the situation as it exists right now. Will must be had. An absence of will cannot exist.
It's a big banger. I'm just thinking about that ambivalence. I'm looking at, on the dependency chapter, this is on page 70 and 71. He quotes Césaire. You know, when I switch on my radio and hear that black men are being lynched in America, I say that they have lied to us. Hitler isn't dead. When I switch on my radio and hear that Jews are being insulted, persecuted, and massacred, I say that they have lied to us. Hitler isn't dead. And finally, when I switch on my radio and hear that in Africa forced labor has been introduced and legalized, I say truly that they have lied to us. Hitler isn't dead. I was just thinking about fascism is colonialism come home. You know, we've test run all of these structures of exploitation. That ambivalence is core to the transference of this exploitation, this structure, moving from something that's defined by appearance, say like white and black, onto our own populations. You know, suddenly it's not just about white and black, but it's like the Jew and not the Jew. You know what I mean? There's just something there. It's like you sit by idly, and then suddenly, one fine day, the bourgeoisie awaken by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up. The torturers standing around the racks invent, refine, and discuss. The crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that it is Nazism, yes. But that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them. That they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it. Until then, it had been applied only to non-European peoples. Just too telling.
No, that's a perfect encapsulation. That's a perfect summing up of the scratch liberal and a fascist bleeds, the Niemöller poem, you know. That's it. Until it's not your problem, it's not your problem.
Right.
You know? Since we're near this, or I was near it, I'm going to go to page 78.
Okay.
Because I was thinking a lot about identity while reading this. And I think he has a lot to say about, obviously, about racialized identity and alterity in general. And on page 78, he's talking about the nature of identity. And he says, in other words, I start suffering from not being a white man insofar as the white man discriminates against me, turns me into a colonized subject, robs me of any value or originality, tells me I am a parasite in the world, that I should toe the line of the white world as quickly as possible, and that we are brute beasts, that we are walking manure, a hideous forerunner of tender cane and silky cotton, that I have no place in the world. A good chunk of that is a quote from Césaire, but he's using this to kind of preface what he later calls a dependency complex. But I think it's a good encapsulation of the point that much of our identity is out of our control. Philosophically, I've thought about this a lot over the years, like how much of my identity is actually known to the world, because your conception of me and my conception of me are not the same thing.
Right.
Which one is more true is the, quote, true version of myself. And I think the point that he's making here is that, like, the outsider's perception is the one that actually affects your life, actually affects your conditions, and that has all sorts of psychological implications. But I think it's a really interesting question, and I appreciate it's very easy to get lost in the clouds when you start talking philosophically about the notion of identity. And he definitely is grounding this in the reality of of one's actual experience.
I just had like a very stupid not childhood argument, but it's like, why are we from here? It's because we're not from there. The here is in relation to the there. I know that that's like a 101
dialectic
thing. Yeah, right. But it goes back to the idea of self-determination. Like, I really love, just a few pages before, Monsieur Manoni gives all of this characterization of the Malagasy, and then he says, the author needs to be sent a message. After having imprisoned the Malagasy in his customs, after having unilaterally analyzed his vision of the world, after having drawn a closed circle around the Malagasy, deliberately ignoring the fact that since Gallieni, the Malagasy have ceased to exist.
Yeah.
Like, that characterization of the people comes from the fact that there is an other. And it just made me think about, I'm thinking about the self-determination question again. To what extent is autonomy of a group of people necessary for liberation on a fundamental level? Your identity comes not only from within, but also from without. So to what extent should that identity be overruling to the rest of the world? To what extent should my existence as an American or as a white man or whatever put me into specific groups? That's a weird way to put that. But what I'm trying to say is that, we have to acknowledge that these categories exist up until the point where they don't need to exist any longer. Just like we had said earlier, so how do you toe the line? Right? It's what's the equitable solution, and it feels ridiculous for me, the white man, to try to come to what an equitable solution is, right? I should be sitting my white ass down and listening. But that truly is the big question on my mind, right? It almost reminds me of the self-actualization discussion we were talking about. It's like, to what extent are you allowed to self-actualize? What extent is your ethnic group allowed to self-determine? I'm just thinking about the autonomy of things there, and I don't know where I'm going with this either. That's the big fucking problem, But if we're attaching our value to somebody via our perception of them, and that's influencing their being as a group of people, how do you avoid that? See, what the fuck, man? This is too much for me.
My mind is just going around kind of reversing the question a little bit, because on 73, Monsieur Manoni says, talking about the colonizer entering into a space that, like the Malagasys, but entering into a place in order to colonize it, he says, he will be deified or devoured. Although the colonizer is in the minority, he does not feel he is made inferior. In Martinique, there are 200 whites who consider themselves superior to the 300,000 people of color. And so, that's making me think a lot about, it's really about reversing the question to not about those who are othered, but about those doing the othering.
Yeah.
The question needs to be framed toward those wielding the power against others, as opposed to those fighting the power wielded against them.
Right.
And so, the question of self-determination, how important is self-determination to a particular ethnic group or whatever, to liberation? It should be more so.
I think maybe the question is not for me to answer, me being the otherer, not the other. To view self-determination from a position of the majority, I think, is to maybe it diminishes the point that self-determination is to making. If you as a group of people have to rely on me to allow you to self-determine, that's not self-determination.
The problem is the allowance.
Yeah.
Is the supposed allowance.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's the thing, though. By being the allower, you are differentiating your positions. You're no longer in the same position. You're now the one and the other.
I guess
fucking philosophy, man.
This is feeling a little bit like coercion again, like the conversation around coercion.
No, but that's such a serious question, right? And I don't even know how to frame the fucking question. This
comes back to the absence of will, because it can't be a situation where, okay, we acknowledge as part of the privileged group that we are the ones making allowance, right? Giving allowance, so to speak. And so, like, the response might be, well, I just won't do anything to interfere, right? So a lack of interference would qualify as, quote, allowance, even though it's not an acknowledgement of a power differential. But also,
I got it.
that lack of interference is an absence of will.
I'm thinking it's back to the mutual recognition, right? The oppressed has to be allowed, but they can't be allowed. You know, they have to at the same time be allowed and also to fight for that allowance. No, fuck, man. I'm thinking about the oppressed and the oppressor. The oppressed has to win their liberation from the oppressor, but they also have to be allowed by the oppressor. It has to be a mutual recognition, right? The oppressor has to allow without that allowance being the only thing. There's also another factor there, and I can't figure it out.
Well, it's because it's not in a vacuum, you know? Like, the quote-unquote oppressor making that allowance is always doing so under some sort of power structure that has allowed us to be the oppressor, you know what I mean? And so, like, I shouldn't have said allowed. There, but
Oh, my God.
we're doing that under a power structure that has created that power differential already. And so, like, to say that that allowance is being made it's just not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, I'm really just thinking about the oppressor, because we're the oppressor, sorry. I'm going to try this one more time, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah.
Because if I say the oppressor has to allow one more time, I'm going to lose my fucking mind. The problem is that if the only thing happening is the oppressor allowing, then that allowance is othering, and it's creating the division. So the oppressor has to allow, but also has to be forced to allow.
No, that's right. That's what Fanon says later when he's talking about fighting for liberation.
Yes.
Yeah. It has to be won through struggle.
Yeah.
If it's just given, then it's not actually liberatory.
Right.
Because giving it away is to a degree acknowledging a powerlessness in it existing. You know what I mean?
What I'm looking for is the fourth part of this. There's four things at play here. The oppressor allowing, the oppressed being allowed. Then what we're talking about is the oppressed fighting back, fighting for allowance. What is the converse of that point? The oppressor being fought off? Does the oppressor have to allow themselves to be fought? That doesn't seem right at all. Let's move the fuck on from this psychobabble.
Yeah. It just has to be that final stage where it's no longer a consideration. That's what it is.
Okay.
Where it's just once it's done, it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, anyway, another time, another place. If you understood what the fuck we said, you can let us know at leftandredfeedback@gmail.com if you have the proper structural formation. Speaking of which, just a side note, when he starts doing fucking diagramming and structural diagramming in the back, that's when I'm like, what does this even mean? What does this even mean?
Yeah, I don't give two shits about that. I also don't care for logical constructions in philosophy. Also, I don't give a shit.
I don't even know what any of that shit means. Like, I mean, I do, but, you know, I know nothing about Lacan. Yeah, once you start diagramming, dog, you lose me.
Yeah, same.
Okay? My eyes rolled when he was like, this is the ego of the oppressed, and then white over the ego of the oppressed or whatever.
I have really nothing to say about all the psychoanalysis, which is like the longest chapter in the book.
80 fucking pages, dude. The biggest takeaway was that I don't understand psychoanalysis. Right?
Yeah. I do feel like if I was more well-versed in Freudian or Jungian psychoanalysis, this probably would have flowed a little better for me, but...
You know, I think that there's a lot of, like, individual points. There's not really anything to talk about for the whole chapter because, again, I don't really understand the psychoanalysis behind it. Mm-hmm. You know, a couple things that really stood out to me, though, completely unrelated to the psychoanalysis portion of it, but on 125, it just hit me in my gut in the little block quote from G. Legman, where he says, "The Americans are the only modern nation, except for the Boers in living memory, who have totally eliminated the native population from their territory. Like, we are a successful settler colonial project. You know, we have an other that we don't even consider. We have an other hidden under the other. We have fucking Native Americans in literal reservations, you know? The reservation is so telling there. Mm-hmm. Fuck. Yeah, that just really hit me. The thing about genitals, man, was really cracking me up. Again, though, like just how I was talking about Dr. Umar, all of that shit, like, this was written 70 years ago. This is in 1952. He talks about, you know, black men coming to get your white women. He basically talks about the Great Replacement. Mm-hmm. You know, like, how telling is it that cuck is a big right-wing insult? Because 99% of the people that the label cuck applies to are doing so willingly out of their own volition because they get enjoyment from that, right? So it's just very interesting, the whole psychosexual pathology of the right wing in relation to sexual impotence, inferiority, especially to black men.
Yeah.
Again, this was written 70 years prior.
Yeah.
When he started talking about, like, the actual scientific average penis sizes,
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, we're really doing this.
Yeah.
We're really doing, this is like a BuzzFeed article, but it's from 1952. Yeah. Just very interesting stuff.
Yeah, and again, I found a lot of the discussion around sexual relations and sexual assault very troubling in a way that I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be taking from it. I couldn't tell if Fanon was falling victim to a misogynistic attitude toward women or if he was decrying it. I couldn't tell.
On 134, he says, basically, isn't this fear of rape precisely a call for rape?
Yeah.
I don't know what he's saying with that.
Well, he follows that just as there are faces that ask to be slapped. Couldn't we speak of women who just ask to be raped?
The big feminist in me was like, what the fuck are you talking about, dog?
I just wrote, excuse me?
A bunch of question marks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say the last 20 pages were probably my favorite part of the book. Chapter 7 and 8, I guess it is.
I didn't give a shit about the Adlerian understanding of the black man, but once he started talking about the black man and Hegel, I was going ham.
Yeah, exactly. That section I thought was quite interesting. He starts it by writing on 191, as long as he has not been effectively recognized by the other, it is this other who remains the focus of his actions. His human worth and reality depend on this other and on his recognition by the other. It is in this other that the meaning of his life is condensed. There is no open conflict between white and black. One day the white master recognized without a struggle the black slave. The idea that it's not an open conflict, I've always described white supremacy as an insidious ideology. It's not something that necessarily operates in the open. It is exactly because the fringe, quote unquote, like the hooded figure or whatever, the KKK member, those people in society today have a tendency to be pushed to the fringe, and that's what allows folks to believe that we live in some sort of post-racial society because we do ostracize those racist figures in general in society.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the roots of white supremacy aren't still turning the cogs of the machine to operate in a way to benefit white folks over all others, to other anyone that is non-white.
Yeah.
And so it's not an open conflict. And I really appreciated the kind of dialectic attitude that he says, that it's kind of like the black man's attitude toward recognition is one that is always facing outward, but the response is an ambivalent response because the conflict is not necessarily open.
Yeah.
The white man doesn't need to have open conflict with the black man for the white man to continue to be privileged.
Right.
For the white man to continue to exist exactly as they wish.
Yeah, those fringe figures are casualties of war. They're acceptable losses.
Yeah.
They're the fucking foot soldiers we send to die so we can have the white supremacy at home.
Yeah. And again, I think that like to a modern reader, that's probably not a particularly new idea, but...
Yeah. I'm just looking at one page ahead on 193. Only conflict and the risk it implies can make human reality in itself for itself come true. The risk implies that I go beyond life, toward an ideal which is transformative of subjective certainty of my own worth into a universally valid objective truth. It's not simply about what we have right now. We are literally talking about transcending the reality, to reach for the stars, whatever that ideal is, and is fucking, it's not a guarantee that we reach it. It's an ideal, but that action, that risk of leaning over the edge, over the balcony, that's what actually will bring the change.
Yeah, and that footnote on that same page there comes from somebody named Monsieur Akil, I guess. This is, a lecture from Monsieur Akil about Richard Wright, the writing of Richard Wright, the great Richard Wright. And this lecturer says, if I were a Negro, I'd commit suicide, meaning that only a black man can accept such treatment without feeling drawn to suicide. Sorry to keep referencing James Baldwin here, but like Baldwin has this excellent quote from an interview that he did where he's talking about white America, and he says, like, the white man knows one thing, that he, more than anything else, wishes not to be black.
Yeah.
Because we recognize to live that existence, to be pushed into that existence, is one that we could not bear.
You know what it really reminds me of is I think it might have been, it was either George Floyd or in St. Louis. But they were talking about looting a Target, and this one woman was just like, just be thankful. All we want is equality and not revenge.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, exactly. If you were forced into this position, you would rightfully be angry, right? You would rightfully be pushed to the point of suicide. But we just laugh it off. I mean, not we, but, you know.
Yeah.
It's just, I wash my hands of it again.
And it's so easy to suggest that, like, violence isn't the way that anything gets solved. You see this narrative around Luigi Mangione quite a lot in certain circles also, where it's like, violence never solved any problem.
Yeah.
It's like, bitch, violence solved every problem. It's the monopolization of violence that is the problem. So the only response to that monopolization is to no longer allow it to be monopolized.
Yeah.
It just comes from such a privileged position. I was a pacifist for many years. I consider myself a reformed pacifist now. We've talked about this on the show before, but I think that essay from Engels and reading Black Power by Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton really changed my attitude toward pacifism, because violence is being done all of the time. To respond to violence with nonviolence is to allow violence to persist. The only appropriate response to violence is a defense of violence through violence. There is this great quote on 195 that I think says a lot about propriety and manners and emancipation and how intertwined all of these things are, because he's kind of relating this story, and he says, "Say thank you to the gentleman," the mother tells her son, "but we know that the son often dreams of shouting some other word, something that would make a scandal." And I think that there's, again, it's like a weird power differential thing where the expectation is that the marginalized are always deferential and always mannerly in their response to being marginalized, and then they're discounted as radical or as whatever if they don't offer that kind of propriety, you know? And I just think that there's something really, really telling in that.
I mean, I think it's all throughout the book, you know, like when he's talking about the contradiction is that in the collective of unconscious, the Antillean is white, but his skin is black, you know, there's clearly a disconnect there. It's like in all the ways that we tell people to act is white, you know, but at a fundamental level, they are not white. You know what I mean? And like that contradiction is a part of the problem. You know, I love on 102. Had I read it correctly, I give it an ever closer reading. On the other side of the white world, there lies a magical black culture, Negro sculpture. This was a part where I was having a hard time discerning his irony or not.
Yeah.
You know, I will say, but this next part, you know, I began to blush with pride. Was this our salvation? I had rationalized the world, and the world had rejected me in the name of color prejudice. Since there was no way to agree on the basis of reason, I resorted to irrationality. It was up to the white man to be more irrational than I. There's no winning, right? You act one way, then you're chastised. You act another way, now you're trying to be white. There's a loss there. There's no dub.
Yeah. Either way, you're derided, you're demonized.
But what am I doing? Nothing doing.
Exactly. You know, I was talking before about violence as a reasonable response and pacifism as a marker of privilege. He speaks to that directly on page 199. He says, "We would not be so naive as to believe that the appeals for reason or respect for human dignity can change reality. To fight is the only solution."
Yeah, we will read Wretched of the Earth at some point, but the whole first part is on violence, because it's just going to have to happen. We're acceptant of that fact at this point. The fight's coming, whether we want it or not, so you might as well be prepared. If you can't get out of it, you might as well get into it.
Get with it.
Yeah.
Do you have anything in particular you want to say about the conclusion?
I think the biggest part was what I've been saying throughout. You know, they recognize themselves as mutually recognizing each other. And then the Marx Bloch quote, of course.
Yeah.
The social revolution cannot draw its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I think it's even uplifting to us, you know? We spend so much time fretting about the failures of past revolutions. The answer is in the future. It's not in the past.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, just a bit of self-crit. Way back, I think it maybe had been on the Paris Commune episode, but we were talking about France in 68 because we expressed some interest in learning about France in 68. And I said that it was a bit in response to the colonial empire. That was wrong. Algeria gained its independence in the early 60s. So, and while France still had colonies in 1968, for the most part, their empire had dissolved. So just want to, we spend a lot of time shooting from the hip on this show. So I'm happy to go back and say that that was incorrect. That was incorrect.
It probably is a good time to jump into the cavalcade of quotes.
Cavalcade of quotes. Do you mind if I start with one?
Go for it.
On page 111, this is so good. This is kind of going into what we were just talking about, how you can't be white, you can't be black, you can't have a past, you can't have a future, right? I tested my hereditary, I did a complete checkup of my sickness. I wanted to be typically black, that was out of the question. I wanted to be white, that was a joke. And when I tried to claim my negritude intellectually as a concept, they snatched it away from me. They proved to me that my reasoning was nothing but a phase in the dialectic. There's something more serious. The Negro, as we have said, creates an anti-racist racism. Yeah. And that just really made me fucking laugh, dude. So many dumb schoolyard arguments that are like, you're being racist, actually. Yeah. I had this conversation the other day in my fucking Discord, dude, about power plus prejudice, That's a fucking middle school conversation, dog. Why are we still having this argument?
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're saying when you're saying that you're being racist too, but you're missing the point.
Yeah.
Okay? You're missing the point. Probably on purpose.
That actually brings me to a quote on 16 that I wrote, because he says, the fact of my reaching down to her for a diagnosis are the signs of a weakening in my relations with other people. He's an idealist, they'll say. Not at all. It's the others who are the scumbags.
Yeah. Well, I love that bit right before to talk about the ideal, right? When he says, he's talking about varicose veins, the ideal versus the material. This is Monsieur Manoni's point of departure. Why does he want to make inferiority complex exist prior to colonization? Here we see the mechanism at work in psychiatry, which explains that there are latent forms of psychosis that become evident following a traumatic experience. In surgery, varicose veins in a patient are caused not by having to stand for 10 hours, but rather by the constitutional weakness of the vein walls. The work mode merely deteriorates the condition further, and the employer's responsibility is assessed to be very limited.
On 35, just a great line, hatred cries out to exist, and he who hates must prove his hatred through action and the appropriate behavior. In a sense, he has to embody hatred.
Nobody's born racist, man. Something that made me chuckle, this is maybe a bit reflective of our own positions here. On 47, incapable of integrating, incapable of going unnoticed, he starts conversing with the dead or at least the absent. And unlike his life, his conversation skims through centuries and over oceans. Marcus Aurelius, Joinville, Pascal, Perez Galdós, Rabindranath Tagore, I don't know who those people are. But, speaking to the dead. Speaking to the dead. We spent a lot of time conversing with the dead at this point.
Yep.
Incapable of integrating.
I feel it. You don't feel seen in the world, find yourself in your books.
I will say on 15, this is a wonderful counter. People will say that there are whites who do not fit our description. Our answer to those objectives is that we are picking holes with the mystified, the mystifiers, or the alienated. And that if there are whites who interact sanely with blacks, those are precisely the cases that will not be taken into account. It is not because the patient's liver is functioning normally that his kidneys are healthy. It's like, yeah, there are some sane whites out there. That's not the fucking point.
If you are offended by this description, it's because you are one of the people being described.
Yeah.
It wasn't clear to me, and perhaps this is me editorializing, and this isn't actually true, but on 107, there's a line. Fanon writes, the white man wants the world, he wants it for himself. He discovers he is the predestined master of the world. He enslaves it. His relationship with the world is one of appropriation, which is a great line, great description. But then later down as he's continuing, he writes, the essence of the world was my property. Between the world and me, there was a relation of coexistence. And I was not sure if the Ta-Nehisi Coates book is named after that line, between the world and me specifically. Yeah. But it jumped out to me and I was like, oh shit. Anyway, I wonder if the title to Ta-Nehisi Coates book is an allusion to that or not. Maybe. I'm not sure.
That's interesting. Oh man. Fucking on 118 and 119, a feeling of inferiority? No. A feeling of not existing. Sin is black as virtue is white. And then later, at the very end of the chapter, the crippled soldier from the Pacific War tells my brother, get used to your color the way I got used to my stump. We are both casualties. And then he says, I refuse to accept this amputation.
Yep.
Just a banging. Very good.
I had that whole section highlighted there, and I love all the allusions to Bigger and Richard Wright. Excellent writer.
I'm unfamiliar, man. I missed it. I mean, there's a lot of this stuff I didn't know anything about.
Oh yeah, Native Son and Black Boy are probably the Richard Wright books that everybody should read. That's where Bigger Thomas comes from. The reference that he's making there.
I see. Not anything worthwhile for our discussion, honestly, but man, the quote when he's talking about how the genital image of the black man infects popular culture. He says imago or imago, which I had never heard of before, but it's a term meaning like an idealized image of a person.
Oh, I didn't know that either.
Yeah, which is quite nice. But I really love when he says in the block quote here, 4 black men with their dicks out in the open would fill a cathedral. It just really made me laugh.
Back to our big question about self-determination and consciousness and allowance on 112.
Okay.
He says, we had appealed to a friend of the colored peoples, and this friend had found nothing better to do than demonstrate the relativity of their action.
Yeah, this is about Sartre.
Yeah, for once this friend, this born Hegelian, had forgotten that consciousness needs to get lost in the night of the absolute, the only condition for attaining self-consciousness.
Like, when he's talking back to Sartre here, it feels like he's ripped the mask off, you know? I know that Sartre is an ally, whatever the fuck that means. But, like, he's talking to Sartre as somebody who is talking down on him, right? The generation of young black poets has just been dealt a fatal blow, you know, or even on the next page after the excerpt from Black Orpheus where he says, and there you have it. I did not create a meaning for myself. I did not fashion a torch to set the world alight. The torch was already there, waiting for its historic chance. It's like it's taken the autonomy out of it completely, right? It's taken the agency out of it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like that torch has been already forged by somebody else, and now you're just here to take advantage of it. There's not actually any self-realization in that.
Yeah, one of the very first quotes on page 19 that really jumped out to me is this idea that the black man's first action is a reaction. He says, it is understandable that the black man's first action is a reaction, and since he is assessed with regard to his degree of assimilation, it is understandable, too, why the returning Antillean speaks only French, because he is striving to underscore the rift that has occurred.
I love the anecdote about the man going up to his father in the field and being like, what is this thing? And the guy drops the plow on his feet and he regains his memory. Very good. I didn't write it down, but I think it's in the end, when he says, like, there are simply too many stories about black people, you know, to be ignored. But to put them all together doesn't get us anywhere either. There was just something so nice about that.
I have one that's kind of similar on 114.
Okay.
Because he says black consciousness is immanent in itself. I am not a potentiality of something. I am fully what I am. I do not have to look for the universal. There's no room for probability inside me. That spoke to something deep within me, the well of confusion around identity and place in the universe. It just really hit hard, something about, this is me maybe bastardizing the quote a little bit, but our potential is meaningless. It's not about what I can be, what I will be. I am fucking here. I am, period. And that has to be enough.
You know what it makes me think of is freedom of opportunity. Everyone has the opportunity, but that doesn't mean anything. You know, the potential doesn't matter because it's not the reality.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the same place where he says that the black experience is ambiguous, you know? So it's like, why are we talking about the black experience? That's ridiculous. To talk about the black experience is to create a black experience. When in reality, like, the black experience is a billion different lived experiences.
Yeah, it is an experience.
Yeah. And conflicting experiences, too. It's just absurd to think about it monolithically.
Yeah, exactly. As a person who is often bogged down by fatalism and cynicism, and it's too easy for me to fall into the well of nihilism while acknowledging what absurdity can offer my life, on 197, he's talking about some person named Fichte. I don't know who that person is. But he says, we said in our introduction that man was an affirmation. We shall never stop repeating it. Yes to life. Yes to love. Yes to generosity. But man is also a negation. No to man's contempt. no to the indignity of man, to the exploitation of man, to the massacre of what is most human in man, freedom. I sometimes feel very weighed down by my cynicism, by the negativity that I feel, but that is a misappropriation. That's me allowing myself to fall victim to recognizing that my negative feelings are a reasonable response to conditions.
Yeah.
And that negative response to those conditions is in itself an affirmation of what life is supposed to be, of what can be beautiful.
On the very next line, there is always resentment in reaction.
Yeah. And he kind of alludes to Nietzsche there, which I love.
Hell yeah. The last one that I really had here, the question that arises is the following. Can the white man behave in a sane manner towards the black man? And can the black man behave in a sane manner towards the white man? Just to expand on that, it's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, he gives actual examples of, race insanity here, but, this shit'll have you fucked up. It's crazy. You simply have to act sanely. We've gotten ourselves so twisted up in this craziness that we're missing societally. We're missing a lot of the most regular, on its face, normal shit. Act sanely.
That's good advice. Yeah, well, so that was Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. What questions were you left with?
Yes. My big question was about self-determination. What was my question? What's the deal with self-determination? What is the equitable solution to all of this madness? And that's that. One thing I didn't mention, but there's a section there where he's saying that they should have a completely alternative curriculum for black children up until at least elementary school. And again, I didn't know if he was being ironic or not there. But, it's is that what the solution looks like? What the fuck is psychoanalysis really all about? That's a question in my mind. How much of this do I need to understand? Hopefully none.
Yeah, Freudian psychoanalysis seems so phallocentric. It's just wild.
Well, it's so crazy that I've heard more critiques of Freud than I've heard actual Freud. That's the thing. I don't feel any kind of way about that. But, you hear about all of the issues with Freud without being told what actually Freud was trying to do. We learned about the id, the ego, and the superego, and that was it. And then people were like, oh, and he actually didn't psychoanalyze any women, so fuck him. And they kind of just push him off to the side.
What I know about Freud is that pretty much everything but the triumvirate man and dream work is separated as quackery. But, people still hang on to the triumvirate man, the id, ego, superego, and dream work.
Yeah, the analysis of dreams or whatever.
And I mean, people will still talk about Oedipal and electrocomplexes, which comes from Freud.
Right.
But I don't know.
I'm certainly not going to go out of my way to learn about the post-clitoral stage of sexual development or whatever.
Yeah.
Fuck that. What about you, Aaron?
Oddly, all of my questions, I had a couple of kind of big questions that I was thinking about a lot while reading this that are, not directly related, so to speak. The first was really around revolutionary identity. Reading this was making me think a lot about what are the cornerstones of identity that we build upon as individuals, and what role does that have in revolutionary ideology? Because I think so much of what I see of revolutionary identity gets caught up in kind of dogmatic idolatry. And I think that that's obviously dangerous, but there's also power in that, right? And so, I don't know, I had a lot of questions about what revolutionary identity is and what it should be, or if it should be, that I was kind of wrestling with. And that got me thinking a lot also about why are leftist spaces, at least the ones that I've been exposed to, so dominated by cishet white men? The answer to that is non-rhetorical. It's because there is a misogyny and a racism, an alienation, a black alienation that is a vital part of the way those organizations get put together and operate. Mm-hmm. So what is the response?
Yeah.
How do we combat that in a meaningful way?
I'm not trying to answer your question here, but I think that there's certainly a systemic imbalance, right? I'm just thinking about last episode when we were saying that Marxism feels ultimately like an intellectual exercise, To what extent is the privilege of intellectualism a white man privilege, in this modern age still?
Yeah.
I think that holds over, and that bleeds into our revolutionary organizations as well. And again, this is not the solution, but the acknowledgement of that is the first step.
Yeah, and I think another part of it comes back to something you said early on, talking about the kind of intertwined nature of race and class. And I think, in my experience, a lot of communists are dismissive of race, the supposed race war, as a manifestation of class war. Yeah. And they'll say, no war but class war, things like that. And they'll be very dismissive of issues of race that come up, because it's like, well, if we solve the issues around class, we'll solve the issues around race. And while there might be intellectually some merit to that, it's terribly dismissive.
That's a high level argument. That's not like a man on the street argument.
And it's also not going to do anything to change the material conditions of a person today.
Right.
And so, like, I don't know. I just think that there's something in there that I'm wrestling with, that I'm trying to wrap my brain around. It's like there is a relationship between identity politics and revolutionary theory. There is a relationship there. And I think a lot of folks that are deep in revolutionary theory are very dismissive of identity politics, and that is obviously problematic.
I don't think it's any goddamn surprise. I don't think it's any coincidence, thank you, me. I don't think it's any fucking coincidence, right, that the revolutionaries, the American revolutionaries post-World War II were black, okay?
Yep.
I mean, like, that's that. You know, what were the white people doing then? Nothing. They were following. Yeah, I mean, especially in America, man. Especially in America. You know, France can say it's racially developed or whatever, but in America, dude, you cannot avoid the question of race. Period.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, it's absurd to say it's just a class thing. That's reductionist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Was this book worth reading?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I've been flip-flopping. Yes, it is worth reading. Yes. Maybe we should restructure the question is the better thing. I think rather than saying, is this book worth reading, maybe a better question is, you should read this book if.
Interesting.
Just because yes or no, yes, this book is worth reading in the lens of our revolutionary project. Is it worth reading? I don't know. That's a tougher question to answer. So maybe yes, no is the wrong framework to look at this question.
How would you finish that stem? This book is worth reading if...
This book is worth reading if you're looking for a further explanation, maybe a dialectical explanation of the conclusion to the colonial problem. Colonialism in the classic style is done with, but the effects of colonialism are certainly not. You know, it's that Malcolm X quote, right? How you can't heal the wound when you haven't even pulled out the knife.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that this is a really, really fantastic look into that kind of thing. And, you know, I felt like one of the white guys that was like, do you recognize yourself in this book? It's like, yeah, I kind of did. You know, I see it. So, yeah, I think this book is worth reading in that regard.
Next up.
What are we reading next, Aaron? It looks way thicker than I remember. My God.
Uh-oh. Next up, we are reading Minima Moralia, Reflections from Damaged Life by Theodor Adorno.
Yes, another Frankfurt School philosopher. Apparently Marcuse was not enough self-flagellation for me. I know Adorno writes a lot about fascism. This book in particular I've heard is about how fascism post-World War II has infected our life. There's a big meme about even the way we close a car door is fascist. It's like, yeah, I need that. Let me get that.
Yeah, so join us, won't you? Hopefully you, listener, will also get the book and read along.
Yes, all our readers, listeners should pick this up. Our copy is from Verso.
Also, listener, any thoughts, reactions, questions, please send them our way at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah, if you listen to this and said, man, they really should have read something else instead, let us know. We want to hear from you. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
I would love to close the episode with this quote from Fanon. He writes, I have found in many writers, intellectual alienation is a creation of bourgeois society. And for me, bourgeois society is any society that becomes ossified in a predetermined mold, stifling any development, progress, or discovery. For me, bourgeois society is a closed society where it's not good to be alive, where the air is rotten and ideas and people are putrefying. And I believe that a man who takes a stand against this living death is in a way a revolutionary.
Hell yeah. Don't get left unread, y'all.
Oh yeah, shit. Bye.